Welcome to another episode of Bright Insights, the podcast that leads you to less stress and more success. Here's your host, Paul Bright.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Bright Insights. I'm your host, Paul Bright. Bottom line up front, we are continuing on with the K is for Knowledge two-part interview with Bill DeMarco. This is part two. Again, you need to be persistently pursuing philosophical knowledge when you become a new leader. And in this episode, we're going to talk about that point where Bill entered into leadership schools and changed the trajectory of his own career, where he retired and became an instructor for the Air Force, and he teaches young officers how to be better leaders, not necessarily the way you would think they would need to be taught. We go over some really cool stuff to include Star Wars in this episode. You don't want to miss all that you can get from this. Thanks for continuing on, and here is the rest of that interview. You're teaching. I mean, you were running the school and now you've retired, so to speak, but you're still teaching and you're building these leadership skills up.
Yeah, and that's
need them.
I think that I knew that was some passion I had for a long time, because that, you go back to this idea of being a commander. I mean, I commanded 5 different organizations, but my passion was always really how do we create more leaders? You know what I mean? It's not if you're commanding an organization, it's how do you build more leaders to go out and command more organizations? You know what I mean? So really what I'm doing right now is that on a even bigger scale, because we have 500 students every year. We've built this leadership institute. We've done a bunch of other things where we're spreading that kind of around the Air Force and beyond. We have 80 international officers here, and joint officers, and so it's cool. It's a good gig. But You're right. It's the idea of moving forward.
So it's not even just American officers. It's a whole international field. And what are some, now I'm just curious, I don't even know if it's going to fit in, but now I'm curious. I'm like, what are some of the things that they're taught overseas in different military cultures that they bring to you? And you're like, oh, that's not how we do things, but I could see us doing things that way, or vice versa. Like, I hope they're not doing things like that when you get back.
Well, I just had a great example of this with some of our Eastern, I'll just say, think Asian officers that, you don't have to look far, I think, in the press right now to see a bunch of senior leaders getting fired.
Yeah.
We're doing
people I knew. I was like, wait a minute. I remember that guy's name from when I was in,
It's terrible. I mean, and these are things that, in my mind, show deep character flaws. And you could just pick one, whether it's sex, whether it's money, whether it's whatever. I mean, it runs the gambit. But let's just take something like sex. Why? I mean, it's not that this guy or girl, but let's say guy, woke up this morning and thought, you know what, I'm really good looking and pretty much every person has a physical attraction towards me. That's not what's going on. This has been a thing that has gone on in this person's life for a long time. So one of the things that our senior leaders are talking to us about is, how do we talk about ethics? And how do we talk about character in our leadership program? So this last year, it was our 4th year of this new course that we've been teaching. We decided to add a pretty big chunk of ethics. And whenever you do this, the first go is, it's like painting a picture. Your first draft is never the best, but you've got to do something. The students weren't really excited about it, because I think a lot of times if you ask our officers, are you ethical? The answer is always yes.
Of course.
And I always say, until you're not. And then it's too late. So let's have these conversations now. So I had a Singaporean officer and a Taiwanese officer these guys, they're brilliant. I love these guys. They told me, why are you focusing on Western ethics? And I kind of went, man, I didn't even think of that, because this goes back to our blind spots when I talked about cognitive diversity and everything else.
Yes.
If you ask a bunch of people like me and then you throw a few academics in there, we're going to go right to Aristotle as an example.
Yeah.
And maybe not think about Lauza or
Marcus
think about
Aurelius. Yeah.
Confucius. Well, Aurelius, we had a lot of Aurelius in the course, but I would say he's very Western.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started pondering, why didn't we ponder Eastern ethics? So I've spent a good bit of time doing some deep dives into Confucius, into Lauza. And what's really interesting to me is how it all aligns. They're different, but they align. The messages are very, very similar. And then another conversation I said now I had, I think, a Japanese officer, the Singaporean, and our Taiwanese officer together. And I mentioned that we'll just read the Tao next year. And one of the guys said, well, that's a very spiritual text. And I said, well, I get it, but I think it's very philosophical. And they were kind of staring at me like, well, wait a minute. And he goes, how would you feel if I said you should put the book of John in your course? And I went, well, we can't do that. And the implication was, well, that's a very philosophical text. If you happen to be from, let's say, South Korea, you know what I mean? I'm just saying that we assume that it's a very spiritual text. Well, no, not to maybe somebody who's a follower of the Tao. It might not be a spiritual text.
Right. It's sort of like decorating your house with Buddhas if you're not Buddhist. It's like, well, it's cool. I like the idea of it when you're Western, but if you were a true follower of Buddhism, it could potentially be like, well, you're just using this piece of my religion instead of embracing the entire religion. So yeah, I could see that.
So I think that's what the international officers really bring, is this idea back to that concept of cognitive diversity. I mean, when these guys come in, and first of all, huge that they would come and talk to me about this, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they don't feel like
they felt comfortable enough.
I can't have that conversation. I mean, they come in and talk to me about this, and we find a way forward. So next year, what we've done is we've condensed the ethics portion into a smaller block, but then we've also got a whole day on comparative ethics, where we'll have actually a PhD from Cambridge, who I've worked with, Dr. Lana Kim, come, and she'll do the comparative process of Western and Eastern sort of ethics and philosophy. So I think it'll be really, really good. And I think it'll be really good to have somebody who's not Caucasian, not male, on stage talking about this idea of comparative ethics.
Right. And so even at, from a non-officer perspective, from a non-military perspective, just coming into leadership, some of the people I've talked to were like, they've been working in this company for 10, 11 years. They knew enough of what management did, but just like the role that they were in. And the next thing you know, their top leadership is gone. Just like how you mentioned, some of our top leaders that were in the military are gone, and it's next man up. And so some of these folks that I've talked to, they're the next man up, or they're working for somebody who's the next man up, who's like, he has no idea what he's doing. So where do you start? What are some basic books? You've mentioned a few of them, but just to get your mind thinking about, I really have to start thinking about the diversity of my pool. I'm no longer buddy, I'm now boss.
We see that in the Air Force, obviously, a lot. I mean, you can be the best pilot in the world, and all of a sudden, you're doing so good at your tactical job, now you're in charge. And this is really what's driven me in this idea of creating the Leadership Institute and Leadership Department for the Air Force, was that I think that's good, right? You identified yourself as an amazing comm person, or an amazing maintenance person, amazing pilot, and now you're in charge. That those two don't equate to each other. You know what I mean? Is right. Because you did this great doesn't mean you'll do that great. So the idea was, we wanted to build courses here that would help people lead better. And what we found was, man, again, I think where you stand matters. In the military, we love checklists.
Yes.
What we really, really want is a checklist to be a great commander. And I have people ask me all the time, just tell me how not to get fired. And I'm thinking, I would so not want to work for you.
No.
It's like, if all you're worried about is not getting fired,
then you're not worried about leading. You're not worried about leading.
I'm worried about self-preservation.
Yeah.
And I would argue those are probably not the best leaders.
Yeah.
So, for us, what we started looking at was, what does the research say is probably one of the most important things with leadership. And really it comes down to this thing, and I'll just throw it in a big bucket and call soft skills. And again, we talked about Myers and Briggs. There's certain personalities that do soft skills really well, and certain personalities like me that struggle. So it's one of those that connecting with people is the key to leadership.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're walking down a trail and you think you're a leader and you look behind you and no one's following, you're not a leader. You're going for a walk.
Yeah.
So it's one of those, when you look behind you, who's following you? And the way to do that is through relationships. So how do you build relationships with people? And I'm not saying, I mean, for me as an ENTJ and let's say an ISFP, it looks really different, but we have to acknowledge that relationships are the key. So how do we build relationships and build those relationships that are based on trust, that are based on vision, that are based on all the things that you would want as a follower?
Right.
How do you do that as a leader?
Right.
And I think that's a great place to start, is just those basic ideas. And there's great books out there, but I mean, books are good. I mean, it's interesting. Like I said, that for me right now, I mean, I'm a big fan of people like Malcolm Gladwell and Simon Sinek. So I love their books. But what is more interesting to me sometimes is to go deeper and ponder the core text of where did that come from. So like Simon, Leaders Eat Last, Start With Why, both great books. And I think great places for a new leader to start. The whole premise of Leaders Eat Last is to take care of your people.
Yeah, it's
right?
a servant leadership philosophy.
Yeah.
It's which I absolutely subscribe to that. That's my own personal style, is to get to know everybody that's under, whatever task. Because nowadays I specialize a lot in shorter projects. We're going to get this done in 3 months. Build a team. Okay, I build a team, whether it's at church, whether it's doing some other thing. And that's where I subscribe to. That's mostly me, whereas it doesn't always fit everybody. Some people want a list. No, I want to build relationships and understand where your strengths are. And I hope I already know your strengths, and that's why I want you on the team, and go from there. But I know that doesn't always fit.
There's the new stuff out there. You've probably heard of emotional intelligence.
Yes.
Which I think EI is great. But this is something as a leader, for me, the first time I was exposed to EI and I took some assessments, I realized I was not emotionally intelligent. I was an emotional idiot. And that's something that you kind of go, ooh, that hurts, because I do care. I care a lot about people. But for me, mission is always more important, or that's why the people are together, right? Because we have to get the mission done.
Yes.
For a T, a thinker is very focused on mission, and F is very focused on people. There's not a right or wrong answer. But the key is, if you happen to be an F, you need to understand the T, and the T has to understand the F.
Yeah.
So that's, a thing I would say is where empathy comes into play.
Yes.
And, I take the Big Five personality assessment, and my empathy usually is pretty low, which is funny because everybody looks at it and they all laugh like, you didn't know that? And I'm like, well, maybe. But so what do you do with that when you find that you're low on empathy? The first thing I think you have to do is ask yourself, do you believe empathy is important?
Yeah.
And if the answer is no, I would say go read something, anything about leadership, and you will find that empathy is the key to good leadership.
Yes.
So once you understand that empathy is important, and you look back at your Big Five and you see that you suck at empathy, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
So for me, what I do is I surround myself with people that are really good at empathy, and I ask them to help me. And I would say, as a leader, that's something that is hard for some leaders to say, help me. What I've found, because of things like you mentioned, the AMOS, there's no career field. There's no preparation to be the AMOS commander. You just are. And then the tsunami happened right before I took command. So when I took command, I had to go over to Hawaii and then take command of the Air Mobility Division in a humanitarian crisis, not knowing what I was doing. So you're faced with a couple of choices. One is try to fake it. And there's a lot of stuff that says fake it till you make it. If you can do that, wonderful. But I'm telling you,
that gets you about 10% of the way.
That's it. I'm saying, so for me, as being a guy with 286,000 people dead, trying to get relief supplies, having generals looking at me, asking me questions, is this a good time to fake it? Or is it a good time to look at the brand new squadron who doesn't even know me and say, guys, I need your help? Yeah. And I opted for the guys, I need your help. And there were some people, senior leaders, that felt that the 15th AMOS was the worst squadron at Travis, because my boss told me they don't understand their mission. They don't want to deploy. They are dysfunctional. I mean, all these things that I had heard before I took command. They weren't. They just didn't have anybody that said, I need your help.
Right.
And when I said, I need your help, man, I'll tell you, I was bowled over with the people wanting to help. I was bowled over looking at how good they were. And they went from, if you believe some of these senior leaders, the worst squadron, 14 months later, getting squadron of the year.
Yeah.
And I'd love to tell you that's because Bill DeMarco is such a great leader. It's not.
I think you connected, but you connected with them. It's like, every time I read something like about the Bad News Bears or whatever, these Bad News Bears squadrons or Bad News Bears groups.
Yes.
Typically it needs somebody who is ready to listen and tap into whatever talent is already there and just bring it out. And I think sometimes leaders, that's really all they have to do. If they can just bring out what's already there, the job becomes quote unquote easier. And in your case, it's getting this mission, which again, you said nobody trains for how do we be in charge of doing something that we don't know is going to happen next, but kind of sort of maybe will happen.
Yes.
How do you train for that? How do you keep people abreast?
So I don't think anybody can really expect you to know everything. I mean, same thing when I became an operations group commander in England. I'd never flown the KC-135 before. And now I'm a colonel learning a new airplane. And arguably, the 100th Ops Group is the best KC-135 crews in the world. I mean, what am I going to teach them about flying a KC-135? Not much. But my boss who hired me actually told me, he goes, I hired you because you have to take these guys to the next level. And I asked him, what's the next level? And he laughed and said, that's why I hired you. So here we're stuck in the, the catch-22 of where do you go? And I remember driving across the, around the runway back to my office and thinking, I don't think I'm going to teach him anything about the jet. So I figured it's all about leadership and in this case, innovation.
Yeah.
So how do I now teach these guys about how to be better leaders and how to be better innovators or creatives? So we spent 2 years kind of going down that path in Mildenhall. And I'll tell you that it wasn't about me coming to them and saying, don't you want to be a great leader like Bill? It was me going out trying to find great leaders like Simon Sinek and bringing them in to pour into our people. And the results, I think, were pretty astounding. If you look at right now, where, let's say, the captains that I worked with back in 2010 to 2012, most all of those guys that were close to me are squadron commanders right now.
Yeah.
Again, I would love to say that's because of Bill. I don't think it was. I think it was we gave them opportunities to go learn and think about leadership before they had to learn and think about it.
Yeah, that's really good. It's funny how it's like a coaching tree when you look at basketball or football or anything. It's like, oh, this guy came from this guy's coaching tree. You mentioned General Bash. I was like, I remember when he wasn't a general and he was commanding Charleston because I was in Airman Leadership School at the time. So I got to see him a lot more than I had planned. Usually when you see a base commander, you might see them once in a blue moon, unless they just happen to be walking in your group. But he was someone I had to see, him and his wife, every 6 weeks. I was like, oh my gosh, I keep running it, And I didn't, and what's interesting, as he kept going up and up, I didn't see him at all in Travis. But yeah, there's a lot of people in that coaching tree, and it's neat to see the influence, how it passes down. And maybe you don't operate the same exact way that he did, but some of the things that you took from him, you're adding your own to it and then passing it down to other people as you've gone on in your career and become an instructor and running the M100, So it's good to see it develop. And then, one day there's going to be the Bill DeMarco philosophy out there.
I don't know if anyone want to read that, but maybe. We'll see.
We'll see. So one final question-ish, finalish, I guess. Permanent beta. Let's explain that for people out there listening, what that means. It's definitely hit me because it's put words to some of the things that I'm trying to do now. Like, I don't think at this point, me doing this podcast series, like I'm the ultimate expert in leadership and this is what I'm bringing to you. I'm bringing to you is like, here's what I know so far. And I know that it's more than people who come in with zero knowledge, but I want to gain more. And so when I read your bio and I saw permanent beta, I was like, I think that's what he's talking about. So explain that to me.
Yeah, first of all, when you said this about leadership experts, man, that's one of those titles that I'd be really worried about people that tell me they're leadership experts. I'm like, I don't know that there is a leadership expert out there because it's just such a dynamic field. There's so many different variables and so many ways to approach it. So I'd always tell people that, people would say, well, Bill, you're a leadership expert or something like that. I'm like, no, I'm really not. I'm a student of leadership. So I look at this, and this is kind of where I got to this beta idea, is that I'm always learning more about leadership. So whether it's like I told you now, I mean, I'm starting a PhD program with some of the folks I know over at Cambridge at a place called Middlesex University in London. And, I'm spending a lot of time looking back at the ancients, which is funny because I'm learning all this stuff now. I mean, I thought I knew a little bit about Aristotle and Socrates, and now I'm talking about interconnectedness. I mean, all of these things that connect and stream from each other. And then, like I mentioned, this idea of Eastern philosophy, and you weave that in there, and then you kind of look at what Lao Tzu was saying and Sun Tzu versus what Aristotle was saying, and you're like, how can they be so similar when they had no way of even knowing
each other,
or coexisted? So there's just some fundamental truths that are probably out there, but I think those are few and far between, and there's a lot of stuff in the middle. So that was this idea of permanent beta. Was that I would read a book and I'd be like, wow, this is amazing, and I'd realize I'm in some like sort of beta now of how I'm looking at leadership. And then I would kind of process, let's say, a guy like Simon Sinek's ideas into my leadership behavior. And then I'd pick up another book and I'd be like, oh, wow, this is really good. Now I've got a beta, Gladwell's ideas and see what I get from that. So the idea was taking things that I was either observing in leaders, like you mentioned, General Bash. Yeah. There are many, many things that General Bash did very, very well that I admired, but he did them because he was General Bash. Back to authenticity. If I did them, they might not be authentic, but what can I take from General Bash and use for Bill DeMarco? Yeah. And I'll beta that. Oh, that worked really well. And as you would imagine, there's some things that you go, that didn't work very well. So I'm going to throw that out and replace that with something that I read from, I don't know, Sun Tzu, you know what I mean? And put that in there. So I think that's just the idea of being a student of leadership is taking ideas, and a lot of us read books, but how many of them take the book and try to put that into what we do?
Actually apply it. Absolutely.
Heck, we talk about philosophy. Look at the Bible. I mean, the Bible to me is one of the ultimate leadership books.
Oh, especially about servant leadership.
Yes. So what are you learning from, let's say, the book of Job, and saying, what can I take from this and beta in my leadership for the next week and see what works? Because if you do something long enough, it becomes habit. And then it's no longer a beta, and you got to find something else to beta. So that's kind of the idea for me. Was I always wanted to be a leader that never stagnated in how I looked at leadership. And even now, as a retired colonel and running a department, I'm still beta testing stuff. And people in the department would be like, "Oh crud, he just read a new book." I'm like, "Oh no.
Here it comes, another lesson plan."
You know what I mean? Let's see what it does.
It makes sense because culture is constantly changing, even though the principles of leadership seem to have existed for thousands of years. The culture and how people think are constantly changing. So I think you have to always be finding some new way to communicate what you've learned, and also learn from what the feedback is that you get from it. I
also think that's true, but then also remaining authentic to yourself.
Yeah.
You're being who you are as a leader. In other words, don't look at like George Patton and go, man, I could be George Patton if you're not George Patton.
I have a whole episode about George Patton that I recorded for last season about how great he was at what he was doing to a point. Yes. There was a point where he could have been so much more to so many people, but he let his style dictate everything versus being able to say, you know what, to get to this next level, I have to do these type of things. And going back to empathy, I think he empathized a whole lot with his soldiers, with his men. He really wanted to take care of them. But when things weren't going towards the mission, that's where the empathy just, was thrown out the window. And no one could really see that or capture that. And not even he could capture that at that point. So, you know what, things got to change a little bit.
Well, that's a great point. Because for me, when I was a young kid, probably high school and college even, I really thought Patton was the ultimate leader.
Yeah.
And so I got to college, I started a minor in history and started learning more and more about Patton. I started thinking, man, this guy was messed up.
Yeah.
And he was, but then you look at any leader, because we're human, right?
Yeah.
So we're all messed up. And that's how I have a elective called Leaders by Design that I
King
teach.
David, same thing.
Yeah. It's pretty popular, but I do the same thing. I start going into class and I'm like, hey, I just want you guys to know that you're all messed up. Yeah. And they all laugh. And I'm like, I know this because I'm all messed up.
Yeah.
And then I say, but when we approach leadership or command or what have you, when we understand that we're all messed up, but we're trying to get through this thing together, and that goes back to cognitive diversity, right?
Yes.
I'm not good at empathy, but I was just thinking in the department right now, I have Lieutenant Colonel Angela Meyer, who's very, very good at empathy. Lieutenant Colonel Brandy Walton, and I'm not saying that women are better than men. They're just people I work closely with that are really good at that. They're happy to help me, and I don't mean that in a mean way. I mean, Brandy and I, we make a lot of jokes, and so she'll come in and make a joke about how I screwed something up. That's okay, but she's helped me. And then I can help her with, staying on target. I mean, the idea of, she's a creative, so she's got a million. She needs like a ideaholic program because she's got 120 good ideas every day.
Send me to that program too, by the way.
Every new shiny penny she wants to chase. So I can help her with focusing on, hey, those are really good ideas, but let's focus on this one. I think this is the one that has the most possibility for success. So I can help her and she can help me.
Yeah, that's where my wife comes in with me because I've got a million ideas and I chase them and then but my ideas would last 3 months. But the more I would bounce them off of her, she'd be like, that works. I can see that, but I think you can do something different. And she doesn't have to know everything about what I do, but she knows me well enough to know this is something that would work in the long term. This is something that you're going to chase for like 3 months. And so when I finally started getting to 6 months and 9 months, I learned there's a way to test how long I'm going to stick with this. And so I started developing my own system of like, if you can do 20 of these things in this idea in a month and not be bored with it, then take it the next step. And I would just keep doing that and keep doing that. And as I got closer to, and this is where someone like you helps, is like, as I got closer to something that was more targeted and more fruitful and closer to being authentic to me, those were the ones that started to pique her interest more. It's like, oh, tell me more about that. Oh, here's where your skill set is, Paul. I can totally see you planning and executing this one. And so that's why, like you said earlier about, synergizing the different personalities are helpful. And so even now for her, when she starts coming up with ideas of things to do, I already sort of, it's funny because the minute she tells me it and I know what she's going for, I already have a 20-step plan for her. And there's been a time where I've given it to her like the next day and it just became overwhelming. It's like, oh, I don't know if I want to do all that. And I was like, oh, no, but you got to do these step by step now. And so I stopped doing that. That's what I had to learn. I was okay, you might have a 20-step plan, but her idea, it's going to take some time. So you have to feed it 2 or 3 pieces at a time. And if you listen to my podcast, you'll hear the music at the beginning and at the end. My son is the one who created that. And so I had to say, how does a 40-plus-year-old dad convince his teenage son to use his music skills to produce a piece of music that he can use on a podcast that he'll never listen to and probably won't tell his friends about? I was like, so it took me 2 or 3 days to figure out how I would communicate this to him because we do have a common bond in music and creativity, but he's a teenager and I'm not. So, but found a way to make it work and he's great with it. So even with him, I won't tell him exactly what I want. I just tell him the mood. I'll say, this is what I'm aiming for. I'm aiming for low key this, or I'm aiming for this ambient sound. And I just leave him alone. And then in a week later, he'll say, all right, how's this sound? And it's almost 90% of the time, it's like right, exactly what I needed. So
it's funny. My Harley is very creative, and he designed the logo for the leadership department.
Oh, wow.
And it's funny because it looks like an official patch. And I always have people tell me, did you get that approved? And I'm like, what? That patch? I go, that's not a patch. It's a logo.
That's
and
really cool.
Like, it's not a patch. It's a logo. It doesn't have to be approved. Logos have to be approved. Patches do. Oh. But so he designed a patch for the department. Because you're right. I mean, it's always interesting when you can reach out to your kids and have them teach you. And that's what, Harley, Luke, and Max teach me stuff every day.
Oh yeah, for sure. When he showed me how to use GarageBand, because I'm someone who 20 years ago, I'd have been like, I'll figure this out on my own. And so he showed it to me and I was like, I already know right now it's going to take me a month to come up with a 30-second sample. I said, as much as I can hear music and do things, but I'm not an instrumental person. I said, I bet he can get it done in 3 days. And sure enough, he got it done in 2. So I was like, I know what I don't know. And I know what I do know. I said, I know how I want it to sound, but I don't want to spend the time it's going to take to get there. But I can trust this dude. And that's how I've been approaching everything now.
Well, I think that's like a key to leadership too, though, right? It's knowing what you do well and knowing what you don't do well and getting people to come along and help you.
Being the dumbest guy in the room for the thing you need the most is I think is one way of putting it. Wow.
And being sure people understand when they help you. As you know, I wrote a piece actually before I took command called The DeMarco Principles of Command. And when I first wrote it was like 75. And I was like, oh, word.
This is too
so
much.
I kept trying to get it down to 10 and I could never get it below, I want to say it's like 30.
Yeah.
But one of the ones that have really stuck, you think about it from a commander's perspective, credit for success belongs to everyone.
Yes.
And if you can, always push it down to the lowest ranking member, only because what that does is that, let's say that, in this case, it's a senior airman in one of the squadrons and I'm an ops group commander. Well, if I can make sure they understand that, senior airman Sally Jones did this, I honor the squadron commander, I honor the flight commander, I honor the first sergeant, the superintendent,
supervisor,
supervisor. And so that makes that compliment or that credit string through a myriad of people, because everybody deserves credit for that. But then I'd always say that failure belongs to the highest ranking person in the room. People sometimes want to argue with me about that. But the point is that if you have the authority to command and that happened, it's your fault.
Yes.
You can go and engage with Sally and talk to her maybe about what she did wrong, but ultimately it was your responsibility. So you can take care of Sally and make sure she understands not to do that again, but it was your command.
Yeah.
And you messed up.
Or in the civilian world, if you were responsible for creating the questions needed for hiring the right people and doing the interviews and subscribing to the vision, and somebody went astray, if there were points where you could have put them back into line and you didn't, ultimately it is you and on the top of that.
Or sometimes it's as simple as the fact that you trust somebody to get the job done and they failed.
And they failed.
But you still trusted that person. So does your boss care that you trusted that person and that person failed?
Yeah.
No. The boss cares.
They see the numbers. Yeah.
This is a great one with General Bash. I mean, where I had a situation and it was something as little as an OPR. But he trusted me to get it to him at the last minute. I trusted our flight commander to get it to me at the last minute, and she failed. And I had to go tell General Bash I screwed up. And Bash looked at me and he goes, "Wait right there." And he picked up the phone and he called the 3-star general to tell the general that he screwed up, that he'd have the OPR to him in the morning. And he looked at me and he goes, "You can leave."
Wow.
So, it's doesn't just stop with you. I mean, who's your boss and who's his boss and who,
it's always going to go up to the top.
Yeah. And that never happened again.
Probably not, because you probably had to listen to him getting some creative, constructive criticism over the phone.
And he never said it's Bill DeMarco's fault.
No, he just owned it. And you're like, dang, walking out of there like, wow.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, thank you for this interview. I could talk to you for like 2 more hours, honestly. There's so many stories and there's so much that I've read about you that at the end of this podcast in the show notes, I'm definitely going to be putting links to more. Always fascinating to listen to you and even watching how you master the greats and how you bring out the oldest philosophies to the forefront. And I'm always reading your quotes on Facebook. And it's like, oh man, that's a good one. Oh, that was written thousands of years ago. What? And how you can bring all that out. And it's really cool. And even integrating some of the Star Wars,
which is important.
Yeah. It's always important.
Yeah.
It's always important. But thank you once again for your time and hope to catch up with you soon.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Bright Insights. For more information on how to have less stress and more success, visit brightinsightsmedia.com.
If you enjoyed this episode in particular, or the Bright Insights podcast overall, subscribe and share with your friends. That gives us a little more visibility. And with that, we can all have less stress and more success.